So a little over 2 weeks ago, a channel known as hbomberguy released a video titled In Defense of Dark Souls 2. As the title implies, he spends about a good hour and 20 minutes trying to explain why he thinks Dark Souls 2 is a good game, largely by contrasting it against Matthew Matos's own critical analysis of the game. Since I myself am a huge Souls fan, have watched all of Matthew Matos's videos, and have watched all of hbomberguy's major critiques as well, I figured I'd throw my own hat into the ring. But rather than straight up critiquing the game, I figured I'd instead focus on the, intentional or otherwise, core theme I found in hbomberguy's video. I want to explain why I think his video is an important contrast to Matthew's, and how it showcases one core aspect to games criticism that so many people choose to ignore, and I'm going to explore this through the lens of Dark Souls. As a brief aside, I figured it'd be important to make a few things clear. Firstly, I really do love Matthew Matos's content, but I too have always felt that his DS2 video and his Bioshock Infinite video are by far his weakest for many of the reasons Bomber himself states. These two videos feel like Matthew was complaining more about the games not matching his expectations he was forcing on them, and less critiquing the games themselves a lot of the time. Second thing of note is that I've played every single Souls game. It started with Demon Souls in late 2010 because I'd heard it was super fun thanks to how thoroughly difficult it was, from the biggest bosses down to the smallest cannon fodder. Being the egomaniac I am, I laughed at the idea of any game being so difficult in every aspect of its encounter design. When I finally got around to playing it, I got whooped. It took me 3 total characters to finally get to the point where I was comfortable enough with the systems to get into the game and actually beat it. Before then, I'd only ever gotten past Boletaria 1-1 on my second character. That was it. By the time it was finally over though, I was in love. I've since beaten it and every game in the series many times, and even went out of my way to get the Platinum Trophy on Bloodborne. I've done challenge runs galore, and even tried some light speedrunning. I'm not saying that to brag, because many other players put my skill in the series to shame. I make that clear because I want it known that I'm passionate about the games, and I know them extremely well. I use them examples in my critical analysis of games all the time, and the only reason I haven't done reviews of them is because I want to make sure I review them right. I want the reviews to do these games justice. So Bomber, to begin, I really like that the theme of your video, again intentional or otherwise, is that people struggled to unlearn the habits from Demon Souls and DS1s, which made a lot of them hate DS2. That for me is by far the most important message your video provides. I've maintained for a long time that the struggle to unlearn one game's language and learn the language of another is what initially turns people off of the Souls series. It's so different from regular action games that people often refuse to learn the mechanics. Just learning not to mash the attack button is a huge task for many people. It's why people who succeed in learning to enjoy the series usually have to restart a few times at first, just like I did. Learning Souls requires a shift in how you think, how you expect the game to treat you as a player, and how you treat the game in return. Ironically, many of these people that did learn how the Souls series wanted them to play, those that love dissecting DS1's genius in forums and whatnot, often refused to do the same with DS2. DS2 was made a martyr. It was made example of simply because people didn't want to learn how it differed from the previous titles they'd fallen in love with. And before anyone brings it up, yes, people broke down and learned how Bloodborne wanted them to play differently. But they only did so with Bloodborne because the game was marketed as being different at the outset. People expected it to be different, and were therefore ready for change. Just because DS2 is a direct sequel, and looks just like more DS1 on the surface, doesn't mean it has to be exactly that though. But that's what people expected. People threw a fit when it wasn't exactly what they were expecting, and as such, they threw the baby out with the bathwater as well, choosing to close their minds off to alternative design choices that they would have otherwise loved had DS2 come before the other two titles. I genuinely believe that had the roles been reversed, people would have criticized DS1 for things like the terrible performance, or the often awful collision detection in areas like the Crystal Cave, and marked it as the black sheep of the series. Not because it's a worse game, but simply because it's different and it came after. But because things happened as they did, anything that wasn't like DS1 was immediately considered inferior instead. This isn't an issue of one game being markedly better than the other in every way. It's an issue of happenstance and how previous experiences can unfairly cast black marks on the experiences we have in the future. This concept shines a light on how few of these people actually understand the intricacies of the game design they praise or criticize, and how many of them are just simply parroting ideas presented by others. They may understand how one idea works because it was told to them, but they don't always have the knowledge base to parse out how a change in that idea might affect the design as a whole. Instead, they tend to find one singular effect and judge the entire idea based on that. I can teleport between bonfires from the beginning now? Well, that means I don't get as good of a sense of the world as when in an interconnected place, so that's 100% garbage decision. There's no give and take to how a lot of people perceive these ideas. There's no reflection on possible reasons for why this change might have been made. There's no playing the devil's advocate. It's either a net negative or a net positive, solely based on that one effect they perceived initially. And it gets even worse when they didn't even find the effect themselves, but may have been told it through others. Entire groups of people go into DS2 with preconceived ideas, ready to hate the game, and it taints their experience. Others never even play the game and instead trash it because it's the social norm. I'm not saying any of these people are dumb, or that they should shut their mouths, or even that some of them aren't even trying to learn, but there's a fine line between criticizing an experience and harmful slander. That's why the goal of my channel is to get people thinking about these games themselves, instead of getting them to agree with or even understand my perspective. Of course I'm going to push my own perspective hard, and of course I'm going to think I'm correct in the moment. Everyone does, duh. But I don't want others to take my word as gospel, because I too will then cease to grow. I will no longer be challenged with ideas that I hadn't thought of. My channel will become an echo chamber. My point is, the problem was never DS2. The problem was that people refused to learn DS2. It's the same problem DS1 had initially. It's the same problem simulation racers have. It's the same problem games like Final Fantasy XIII have. People refuse to learn the new language of play being presented to them, and blame the game for their own stubborn nature. As a quick side note, I hate to break it to you, Bomber, but the concept of play conditioning has been around for a long while. Obviously, you realistically knew that already, but I just thought I'd point it out. I myself made a video on the same subject from 2 years ago, though it's focused more on how games can teach their language of play, as I call it, rather than on the concept as a whole. Books talk about it, there have been GDC talks entirely about it, I guarantee Extra Credits has an episode about it that I'm forgetting, etc. Again, something you already knew. I just wanted to rub it in your face that I beat you to the punch by about 1.5 years. Anyway, mechanically, the key to good Souls design is asking the player to use universal mechanics specific to that game, like lock-on, ways to avoid damage, one-handing versus two-handing, in different ways, while simultaneously allowing them to use any non-universal or avoidable mechanics, like melee versus magic versus bows, heavy armor versus light armor, elements, magic types, etc., in the ways they see fit. You don't have to use magic to beat a Souls game, but you do need to know how to avoid damage, for example. That's the main difference between the two groups of mechanics. Given that idea, Dark Souls at its best gives every class reasons to learn the ins and outs of all of the universal mechanics, the mechanics everyone has access to and everyone should be utilizing. And it tries its hardest to give them a deep understanding of when and how these mechanics are best utilized. There are times when the game pushes you toward locking on as a necessity, and other times where they show you that constantly locking on is a stupid idea, like when battling the Iron Golem in DS1 for example. There are enemies who are just better blocked because they're so swift, and others that do so much stamina damage that they should instead be dodged. Meanwhile, the games tailor these same encounters to challenge different classes in particular ways. The Capra Demon can be a nightmare if you play with slow melee weapons and heavy armor, but use sorceries instead and it's absolute cake. Meanwhile, Sif can be difficult to hit with mini sorceries because he leaps around so quickly. but he's defenseless if you hack at his ankles and use a shield. The pairing of these two layers of balance, universal mechanics with optional mechanics layered on top, is the Souls series' secret sauce. Universal mechanics teach players the correct language of play that everyone needs to know. It conditions players, as Bomber would put it. Meanwhile, the other half allows the player to truly play in nearly any way they desire, while still finding the right level of difficulty flow. Before anyone brings it up, obviously there are ways to cheat these systems. They're not perfect, no game is perfect. But Souls is one of the few action games which leans heavily on RPG mechanics that simultaneously relies mostly on player skill, while also giving the player meaningful freedom in how they play. As I've said on this channel before, one of my favorite challenges I've done in a game was when I did a run of DS1 solely using Dual Cestus. Why? Because it was possible without grinding, without every battle being a war of attrition, and without cheating. It was still balanced almost perfectly for skill. Compare that with how I usually play Souls, with fast rolling, a mid-sized shield, and an ultra greatsword, which is still perfectly balanced. Souls is best when it accounts for all of the options it gives its players, and gives them all different ways to adequately strategize. New game playthroughs of Souls games are mechanically mostly about restricting yourself further and further as you go, and finding ways to utilize these optional mechanics effectively as a way to supplement the universal mechanics. It's surprising how many people don't realize, but most RPGs do the opposite by giving players more and more options as they go. Leveling usually unlocks access to more options in other RPGs. You'll run out of ways to grow in destruction magic or light armor, so you'll start investing in illusion magic or pick up the speech skill to avoid combat encounters altogether. They'll give you access to more materia of more types with more slots to put them in, or you'll run out of stealth skill tree options and start getting explosive offensive abilities. You'll eventually become a jack of all trades. In Souls, that only really starts happening post-New Game, sometimes even post-New Game Plus. Souls asks you to specialize instead. Each soul level starts to get so expensive that it's a huge risk to suddenly start trying to learn to use heavy-hitting miracles when you've spent 30 plus levels in strength so that you can wield Smo's hammer. Other games take the easy way out by giving players so many options that they always have 50 ways to take care of any situation, with usually one obviously optimal one. Souls still balances for all these options, but expects you to only have access to one or two at a time. Since they know players won't be jacks of all trades, they're forced to balance correctly for all of these options. Otherwise, someone's playthrough could be utterly ruined 50 hours in simply because they picked the wrong class. And even in those edge cases where something does go awry, any player can always fall back on those core universal mechanics to succeed. Proper dodge timing or learning to parry or utilizing items will always get you through. Keep in mind, by the way, balancing these games correctly doesn't always mean it's gotta be super challenging 100% of the time. Balancing it correctly also means allowing a magic user to feel overpowered against an enemy they logically should be able to utterly destroy, for example. And then you make them feel overwhelmed by the next enemy type introduced. It's about creating that difficulty flow that gives people places of challenge and places to breathe. Design always has upsides and downsides. There is no objectively best idea in design. Ideas work better or worse entirely depending on what other ideas they're paired with, and how that pairing is structured. If anything, I think that's what Bomber's video is best at highlighting, whether we're talking mechanical design, environmental design, or whatever else. Now, I believe the video definitely does stumble at points. I might as well hit on a few examples. For one thing, I think people are correct when they say Dark Souls 2's use of life gems is far too forgiving. The first time I played through Dark Souls 2, I actually never got Melentia to come to Majula, meaning I thought life gems were finite. As such, I never used them. At all. I did the entire game with just Estus, and actually the game felt like it was balanced for Estus only, and only when I factored in life gems in subsequent playthroughs did it become astonishingly easy to survive in any area. The only threat was death during hard encounters, not death due to poor health management. Estus in DS1 was an important part of conditioning the player, among also immersing the player in the world through difficulty. There are correct ways to do high-risk health management and backtracking in games, and I think DS1 hits on one of those ways. It told players to think smart, not play recklessly and spam life gems. It forced players to rely on the skills the game wanted them to learn, which life gems allowed players to ignore. It's extraordinarily time-consuming to grind your way through DS1, intentionally. It will take you forever to grind enough levels so that you can just whale your way through bosses. This same grinding is cake in DS2 because life gems are so cheap and so useful. Life gems do provide interesting gameplay benefits, as Bomber talks about, like allowing players to momentarily play risky and tank hits by using the life gem before they go to hit their enemy that they know they're going to get hit back by. But the thing is, you could still have all of the benefits of life gems while getting rid of the problems they cause simply by having the game treat them like Estus. Call life gems Estus crystals instead, and have them replenish at bonfires just like your flask. Make it so that players are limited to a max of 10 Estus, which let's say instantly heal like they do in DS1, and a max of 10 Estus crystals, which act just like life gems. Both numbers start at 1 just like in the normal game, and you find Estus shards and, let's say ashen dust to expand your maximum allowance of each. It's basically like Estus versus Ashen Estus in Dark Souls 3. Problem solved. With such a simple change, life gems are infinite, but not during any specific run through an area. You don't have to worry about grinding them, but they also will never break the game. You can still strategize around them, but they're not going to guarantee you a win just because you know how to safely heal. Again though, Bomber's video does a good job overall at presenting the idea that DS2 isn't bad because it's different. It just trades some things DS1 excelled at to excel at things DS1 struggled with. Those trades have to happen. There is no optimal design, and every design decision will ultimately prevent you from implementing others. Every idea you implement will always close off other potential avenues, preventing the successful use of other ideas. Recognizing when this happens and how to use/create new alternatives is what adds up to great games. Use ideas that work together, not ideas that sound cool together. Again, DS2 isn't bad because it's different, it's just different. Like I said earlier, I don't agree with all of Bomber's points obviously, as already made clear with life gems. Like, I still hold shields as a fun, viable, and interesting aspect of play in Souls. When you really break it down, shields are effectively like a dodge, but they offer ease of use and stability and footing for the price of chip damage, extra weight, slower stamina regen when blocking, or higher stamina cost to negate damage, usually some combination of several of these actually. Shields are easy to use and don't need proper timing to avoid damage. Shields allow me to stand my ground when near narrow ledges or traps, and allow me to easily negate damage in tight spaces. They allow me to much more directly control enemy positioning, rather than enemy attacks controlling my position. It's a give and take situation where the unique upsides and downsides of the shield are what makes it interesting to strategize around. Just knowing when it's safe to lower my shield for faster stamina regen is super exhilarating, for example. Generally, the shield is low risk, high situational control, where dodges are the opposite much of the time. And yet, even then, the game can turn this on its head. Sometimes blocking takes so much stamina, or can't block enough elemental damage, that dodging is less risky. And often, in that sort of situation, the enemy is so big that the mobility of dodging suddenly allows you to better control the enemy position, where overusing the shield may instead force you into a corner. Again, this is why Souls is so great, because both play styles, among all of the others as well, come with their own interesting quirks that get challenged in different ways at different times. If you're a no shields player, that's fine. I suck terribly at using spears and rapiers, and as such I don't use them much. They feel boring to me, but I'm not about to act like that makes them boring or lazy alternatives for everyone. It's honestly similar to the difference between using front-wheel drive cars versus using rear-wheel drive cars in a sim racer. There are different means to the same end, which provide their own engaging challenges and benefits. One of the best things about shields is actually that you're not locked into using them when you have one equipped. You can still dodge or parry when you have a shield equipped, meaning you incur stuff like the weight penalty of having it in your inventory, but that means you always have an extra option in your arsenal, because it doesn't take any of the other options away. Moving on, I disagree with Bomber on parrying too. This video isn't going to get restricted because I'm using the word bomber so much, is it? Anyway, I personally parry way more in DS1 than DS2. Just like DS2's parry gels with Bomber more, DS1's gels with me more. He loves the great sound design for DS2's parries, and I love the instant gratification of immediately riposting in DS1. But this once again goes back to what I think his video serves to illustrate so well. This is yet another area where a mechanic was balanced differently between the games to suit different ways of playing, and it works well in both. Neither is necessarily better overall. I also disagree with the idea that DS1 struggled to teach players what they needed to know. One has to remember, since nobody bought Demon Souls, DS1 already had its hands full with teaching players to forget nearly everything they knew about action games, and learn something entirely different. DS2 likewise was released in a time when people either already knew the basics of the series, or had heard more than enough to know they needed to expect something massively different from a normal game. They were already prepped. I believe DS1 did an amazing job considering it had a much bigger problem to solve than DS2, and it did it mostly with not but a few optional tutorial text boxes in the first few areas, and clever design throughout the rest of the game. Was it perfect? Heck no, but neither was DS2. Adaptability. The point is, Dark Souls 2's problem indeed isn't Dark Souls 2. It's the fact that people automatically have to look at things from a black and white perspective. If DS1 is a masterpiece, DS2 has to be garbage in the eyes of most. The reality though is that both can be great, while both also have major flaws. The quality of these games isn't mutually exclusive, nor is it for any other series. I don't know why people find it so difficult to like one thing and like another thing slightly more or slightly less. Why do people find it hard to admire and respect something but dislike it on a personal level? Instead, we always have to like one thing and hate the other, which prevents true exploration of topics. Eventually it leads to two very vitriolic camps that refuse to listen to each other, which is why videos like yours, Bomber, have to be titled In Defense of Dark Souls 2 or Fallout 3 is garbage and here's why. That's not a criticism of your titling habits, but rather an observation of the nature of these conversations. The acidic nature of conversing about these topics forced you to take a defensive position from the very beginning. It's not a good place for any conversation to start, because it's very difficult to not accidentally just spread more acid in the process. As a small aside before I close this out, if I had to criticize your Dark Souls 2 video specifically, Bomber, I would say that it struggles from the same problems your other long-form critiques have. 1. When using examples, you tend to try and illustrate where one game does one thing correctly, and where another game does something else that's vaguely related incorrectly. Like when you compare Dark Souls 2's open area encounters to Dark Souls 1's more closed off area encounters. Both games have plenty of encounters in open areas and more claustrophobic areas, so a better choice would be to compare DS2's open area encounters to DS1's open area encounters to illustrate why you feel DS1 may do that specific thing worse. Otherwise, you're kind of comparing apples to oranges. Secondly, you have a bit of a habit of cheekily using sarcasm to imply that your opinions are fact. You know that. You even mention it in your video. This by itself is obviously fine. It can be funny. But I've also noticed that you tend to use it often as a way to avoid further explaining your points to the degree that they may deserve. It sometimes feels like you don't know what else to add, but you don't feel like you've adequately said what you needed to say, and so you default to a sarcastic quip as a closer. Other times it feels like you're trying to cover up potential cracks in your own argument that probably should be addressed. Because of this, the sarcasm sometimes comes across as if it's getting in the way of your points at points. It undermines your goals and can feel a bit disingenuous. These things can make it difficult for a viewer to not want to try and resist the points you're trying to make, simply out of gut reaction. You can come off as a bit hostile and egotistical, hence why you initially get responses like the one Mitch L did, when ones like his follow-up response are definitely better for everyone. It doesn't matter how much one adds to the conversation if the way they present it derails everyone into passively talking crap about each other instead. You're definitely improving at this each time you make a long-form critique, with your Fallout 3 video for example coming off as really weak in comparison. And keep in mind, this is coming from someone who loves DS2 and thinks Fallout 3 is a horribly flawed experience, to say it lightly. I'm someone who's fully equipped to agree with your positions on both games, and yet I found the way you talked about Fallout 3 had me defending a game I really don't enjoy more than it had me in agreement. That shouldn't happen when I was on your side when I initially clicked on the video. Bottom line, I enjoyed your DS2 video more than either of your other large critiques to date, so I'd say it's a success. Those last few paragraphs weren't meant to insult, but rather to give you a level-headed and honest explanation of how I personally react to your content. Hopefully something you may find useful. Think of it as an attempt at helpful feedback from a fellow creator who has to stress over the same sort of stuff. P.S. I'm a true believer. Hey, thanks for watching this video. If you're interested in another one, here's the last one that I uploaded. You can also follow me on Twitter or subscribe by hitting the subscribe button.